It happened in the middle of summer, when the wind was too warm to carry voices, and yet someone kept whispering just outside the door. They say the plate was empty, but the chair was still warm. No name was ever written on the ledger, only a date and the word swallowed. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? I always find it eerie. How stories like this don't stay put. They travel across wires, through windows, into empty kitchens, into places where something used to sit but doesn't anymore. Welcome to Sleepless Horror. Tonight's story is about a ritual that was supposed to keep the living safe, but someone performed it too late. Stories like this were never meant to be told aloud. But the house still stands, and the door still creaks, and the plate is still there. So I'll tell it the way it was told to me. The village was quiet in those days. Not silent, just expectant. It was the kind of place where shutters closed before the sun went down and children were warned not to follow the smell of bread if no one had been baking. Even now the roads are narrow. The houses lean in close, as if they're whispering secrets to each other about things they promised never to say out loud. And then there was him, the man with no family, who lived at the edge of the woods where the moss grew too thick to sweep away. They called him the Sin Eater, not with malice, but with the kind of fear that makes people polite. He never joined the harvest dances, never sang in the chapel, never lifted his eyes unless you spoke his name twice. But when someone died, they sent for him. He didn't knock, didn't ask permission, just laid the wooden plate on the chest of the dead and waited for silence to settle. Bread, salt, ale. 3 simple things meant to carry the burden. From the soul to the body to the earth. But the last time he was seen, there was no body. Only a plate, only crumbs, only that word again. Swallowed, if you've ever visited a house where a single chair is still pulled out from the table and no one remembers who sat there last. Then you already understand the feeling of this place. It wasn't haunted in the usual way. There were no wails, no flickering lights, no cold spots that made your spine ache. It was quieter than that, more patient, the kind of haunting that lingers in the way the air moves around corners, or how a room never quite feels full, even when it's crowded. And on the last day he was seen, the Sin Eater didn't leave the woods. They say he prepared the plate anyway, as if someone was still dying, or already had, or maybe never stopped. The meal was placed on the doorstep of a locked room, and when the villagers returned the next morning, the bread was gone, the salt disturbed, the ale untouched, but in the center of the plate was a single black feather, wet, folded inward, still warm. That's where we'll begin. The meal was made, the door was closed, and the living had already started forgetting. But something hadn't, and it was still hungry. Stay with me. There's more to show you. If you've ever walked into a room and forgotten what you came for, only to feel like something in the room remembered for you, you'll understand how that house felt. It had no name. just a number carved above the door. One of those fading cottages where the wood was too soft to knock on. But inside was the room that stayed locked. No one had been inside it for 20 years. Not since the last of the Penhall family was buried. Not since the plate was placed outside it 3 nights in a row. And the smell of rotting apples drifted through the floorboards. The villagers said it was superstition, that the room had been sealed, so grief wouldn't get out. But old Elric, the one who still kept the morning ledger, he remembered differently. He remembered the morning the Sin Eater came. He remembered the 4th plate. That plate hadn't been for the dead. No, the burial had already been done. The headstone had settled, the morning bread already shared, the name already sung. But 3 weeks later, the widow began speaking in her sleep, whispering names that weren't from the family line. They placed honey on her windowsill, burned rosemary by the bed. But nothing stopped the humming. That's when they called for the Sin Eater again, not to cleanse the house, but to contain it. The 4th plate was different. No salt, no ale, only the bread, flattened, scorched, and pressed into the shape of a mouth. It was placed on the floor, outside the locked room, and in the morning, only ash remained. They said it worked, that the humming stopped, that the widow stopped waking with dried petals in her hands. But she never opened the door again. She moved to the attic, and when she passed, quietly, without pain, they left the house untouched. Only Elric kept a note in the ledger. Plate number 4, consumed. You might be wondering who the meal was meant for, and so were they. Some said it was for a spirit that never received its ritual, a sin left behind by accident, a second soul too afraid to follow. Others believed something else, that the Sin Eater hadn't been called, but drawn, that the meal was not made in service, but in surrender, that he had offered up something of his own to keep it locked inside. There's something strange about the way dust settles in that house. It moves inward, toward the door, as if even the walls remember where the hunger was kept. And outside the locked room, the floorboards dip slightly, as though too many feet have stood there, waiting. The Sin Eater's plate still rests on the mantel, not cleaned, not polished, just waiting. The wooden rim is stained now, not with food, but with something black and waxy. Soft to the touch, but brittle if left in sunlight. No one's ever dared wipe it clean. And every spring, a black feather is found on the doorstep. Damp, folded, never caught in the wind. That house was eventually listed for sale. 3 times. Each time, the offer was accepted, the paperwork signed, the keys exchanged, but no one ever moved in. One man said the walls were too narrow. One said the oven never cooled down. One simply left his suitcase on the doorstep and never returned. Each time, the villagers took the feather back inside, laid it beside the plate, and locked the door. If you've ever stood in front of something you're not supposed to touch, but felt your hands ache anyway, you'll understand why Elric's granddaughter, Maeve, couldn't stop looking at the door. She was 7 when the house became hers. A quiet child, always humming, never asked for sweets, only watched the windows when it rained. And one day, she asked what was behind the door. Elric didn't lie. He just said, "Not yours." But that night, he placed the Sin Eater's plate back on the floor. Salt, bread, and a small, polished pebble that hadn't been there before. Maeve watched from the stairs, silent, still. She didn't ask again, but she started drawing feathers, over and over, folded inward, still warm. That was when the village stopped using her name, not out of cruelty, but reverence. They just called her the Watcher's Girl, as if the act of seeing was now a kind of inheritance. And the plate, it hasn't moved since. But the wax ring around its edge grows thinner every year, like something is still being burned away, or like someone keeps trying to get out. You ever notice how some objects refuse to gather dust, even when no one touches them, even when the rest of the shelf is gray with it? They stay clean, as if the air moves around them differently, or something unseen keeps them ready. That's how the Sin Eater's plate was. Still smooth, still warm on certain nights, still marked with that black ring, like wax had once pooled there and hardened into silence. Maeve didn't clean it. She only looked, sometimes traced the edge, with a cloth she never used for anything else. But one morning, when she was 16, the plate wasn't where she'd left it. It had moved, only slightly, but enough to leave a circle in the dust. And in the center wasn't bread, wasn't salt, just a flat, square piece of paper, unmarked, soft at the edges, smelled faintly of ash and oil. She burned it in the fireplace, not out of fear, but out of something older, something like respect. That night, the wind whistled through the broken kitchen window, but only one sound came from the locked room, a single, long ... breath. They say sin-eating was outlawed. In the early 1800s, that priests called it heresy, that doctors called it unsanitary, that villagers eventually called it unnecessary. But in places where the ground stayed soft, even in winter, the ritual held on. Because it was never really for the dead. It was for the living, those left behind, burdened by secrets they couldn't carry, and confessions they didn't know how to name. The Sin Eater made it easier. He made the silence heavier, so they could walk away lighter. But sometimes, if the sin was too heavy, he didn't carry it far. Sometimes it settled in a room, in a wall, in a plate. Would you have opened it? The locked room, I mean. If the humming stopped, if the feather returned, if the plate began to sweat, would you have turned the knob? Maeve waited 4 more years. She watched the plate each day, polished it, prayed to it, listened to it. Some nights, she swore the wood creaked with words. And one spring evening, when the bees returned early, and the ash tree in the yard began to split, she placed a new meal on the plate. Bread, salt, and a single coin. not from any known currency. Worn, bent, stamped with an animal she'd never seen before. She didn't know why she added it, only that she had woken with it, pressed in her palm. At midnight, the wind stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Even the trees stood still like the world was holding its breath. And then came the voice. It didn't speak, not in the way mouths do. It simply pressed itself into the house, into the floors, the glass, the plate, a sound that had shape, that folded in on itself, that tasted like copper and made her teeth ache. The plate cracked, a clean split down the middle, and when she touched it, she saw things that weren't hers. A child buried beneath a floor, a woman stitching salt into curtains, a name chanted backward, and the feather, always the feather, pressed into the mouth of the dead, to keep the sin from speaking again. Maeve fell backward, slept on the floor, woke up sore and shivering, but the room was still locked. The coin was gone, and the crack in the plate had mended itself. Almost. There was now a groove in the wood, a faint carving. Not letters, but the shape of a hand. Held open, waiting. She placed the plate back on the mantel. Didn't speak of what she'd seen. Didn't return to the fireplace. But the next morning, Elric's old ledger was found, sitting open on the kitchen table, no dust on the cover, no footprints on the floor, and in the margin of the last page, written in a hand no one recognized, meal accepted, but others. They leave something behind even when they're gone. A shape in the dust, a hollow in the air, a silence too heavy for one room to hold. The plate was gone. Maeve searched the mantel first, then the table, then the locked room's threshold, though she never touched the handle. Nothing, only a faint ring in the floorboards, where the wood had lightened, and beside it, a feather split in two, still damp, still warm. She didn't cry, didn't call for help, just sat down in the middle of the hallway and closed her eyes. And for the first time since she was a child, she hummed. The melody wasn't hers. It rose without instruction, a low, circling sound that made her teeth ache and the windows hum back. They say salt can keep spirits out, that if you pour a line across a doorway, no one dead, or worse, can cross it. But there's another belief, an older one, that salt can also trap what's already inside. Maeve didn't know which was true. She just knew what she saw. When she came down the stairs the next morning, a thin white line spread in a perfect circle around the locked room. Each grain placed like it had been counted. No footprints, no trail from the kitchen. And in the center of the door, a new mark. Not scratched, not carved, branded. The shape of an open hand reaching upward, fingers long, curled, as if inviting someone to take hold. She didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. She felt the pressure of something trying to remember itself. The kind of memory that isn't yours, but uses your body to return. Each breath felt too loud, each thought too sharp. So she lit every candle in the house and waited for the dark to answer. When it did, It came quietly. No scream, no sudden cold. Just the scent of scorched time and the creak of the stairs shifting. One step at a time. Maeve didn't move. She whispered the only thing she could. "If it's mine, I'll carry it." The wind outside stopped, and in the mirror above the hearth, she saw a second reflection. Not beside her, not behind her, but beneath her. Like someone was watching from the other side of the floor. She followed the sound to the old cellar beneath the house. The door was swollen shut, hadn't opened in decades, but that night it swung inward, as if something had been waiting. The room was dry, too dry, like every bit of moisture had been swallowed. And in the center, on the cold stone floor, was the plate. Whole again, but different. No feather, no salt, only a folded napkin, tied with twine. Still warm, still breathing. She unwrapped it slowly, expecting what? A warning, a name. Instead, she found teeth. 3 small human teeth, polished, marked with soot, and tucked beneath them. A scrap of fabric from her childhood nightgown. Maeve didn't scream, didn't cry, just knelt down beside the plate and whispered her own name. 3 times. The cellar answered. The flame from her candle grew sideways, pulling toward the north wall. Behind it, the bricks had loosened, and wedged in the space between was a small wooden box, wrapped in waxed linen, sealed with dried heather and thorn. She didn't open it. Not then. Only carried it upstairs and placed it in the empty chair by the hearth. The same one the Sin Eater always used when he was waiting. She didn't sleep. She sat beside the chair and watched the box, as if it might breathe again. And before dawn, something changed in the air. The house no longer felt haunted, it felt inhabited, like something old had moved back in. Something that remembered how things were done, how meals were taken, how silence was shared. She felt her name echo in the wood beneath her feet. But it wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to something older, something waiting, and it was almost ready to eat again. They said it happened before, in another village, on the edge of a hill where nothing grew, except bones and heather. There was no house, just a field with a single stone, etched in a language no one speaks anymore. But the story remains. A woman who carried a plate from funeral to funeral, never weeping, never speaking, until the plate cracked and she was never seen again. Only her chair remained, turned inward, waiting, long before churches banned it, before the word sin belonged to pulpits and punishments. There were other names: burden keepers, whisper eaters, the hollow-mouthed. They didn't wear robes, they wore plain cloth. Their feet were always bare, and when someone died, they sat beside the body and breathed in the final sigh, believing it contained everything the soul couldn't confess aloud. Bread was only the symbol, salt the seal, But the act itself, that was something older, something sacred and feared. In parts of old Wales, they buried the sin-eaters face down, said it kept the sins from rising. In the Scottish borders, they were burned with their plates, tied to their chests. No tombstones, no names, just small black feathers, buried beneath the hearthstones, so the hunger wouldn't return. But sometimes, the wind shifted, and the feathers found their way back. Maeve never spoke of the box, not to the council, not to the priest, not even to the mirror. But the plate was seen again, once, during the autumn solstice festival. A boy wandered into the woods, chasing fireflies near the old stream. When he came back, he carried a plate wrapped in cloth. Said he found it under a tree, with bread already placed. Said it was still warm. His parents buried it that same night. But he never forgot the shape of it. And when he was older, he carved the image into the chapel door. A simple plate, open hand, black feather curled across the edge. People asked where he got the symbol. He only said, "It's not for the dead." If you go there now, to that village with no name, you might pass a cottage with shuttered windows and a stone that sinks each spring. You might hear humming. In the windless dark, you might smell salt. When no one's cooking, you might even find a door that refuses to open, even though the key is still in the lock. But no one remembers who lived there. Only that someone did, and that they were waiting for something to be swallowed. There's an old belief that every sin swallowed by another becomes a shadow at the back of their throat. Not visible, not heavy, but enough to make their voice change. When they say certain names, enough to make their breath fog the mirror, even when the air is still, enough to make the living start to forget their own weight, and enough to leave a feather behind. When the room finally empties, they say the original sin-eater wasn't a man, nor a priest, nor even a person at all, but a silence, so patient, so hungry, that it took the shape of a human, just to be closer to the things it wanted, and it learned to eat what others feared to hold. Pain, regret, secrets folded like napkins and left at the foot of the bed. But it never lost its shape, only passed it along, from hand ... to plate to child, until one day even the silence forgot who it had started with. But the plate remembered, and that was enough. The plate was empty, but the chair was still warm. That's how it ends. Not with a scream, not with a door slamming shut, but with the faint scent of ash, and a silence that's been fed. Maeve lived alone for the rest of her days, not out of fear, not out of grief, but because the house had become something else, a keeper, a vessel, a mouth that never forgot how to open. And each year, on the longest night, she set the plate on the hearth. No food, no salt, just a single feather, folded inward and warmed by the fire. She never asked it for anything, only listened, and sometimes it answered. One winter, a stranger came to the village, said he was collecting stories, said he'd heard about the humming and the girl who never aged. But when he reached the house, he stopped. He didn't knock, didn't open his notebook, only stood there, watching the door, like it might blink. And when he turned to leave, he left something behind. A bundle of dried rosemary and a silver coin tucked into the stone wall, a quiet offering for something he didn't want to understand. They say the house still stands, that the walls lean in as if listening, that the chimney still exhales on nights with no fire, and that if you press your ear to the back of the mirror above the hearth, you'll hear chewing, slow, deliberate, like someone finishing a meal that was started long before you were born. The ledger was found in the attic, pages missing, ink faded, but the last entry was clear. No date, no name, just one word, written in a soft hand, satisfied. Some shadows, they don't chase you. They wait, quietly, patiently. And when you're ready, when the weight you carry becomes too much to bear, they open their mouth without judgment, and they eat, not to harm, not to punish, but to remember what others were too afraid to keep. The feather was found in Maeve's bed, still warm, still damp. No plate, no handprint, no door, just a single black mark above the hearth, like a mouth closed for the last time. And in the village, they stopped telling the story, not because they forgot, but because the house had learned it by heart, and now it hums it to itself. When no one is listening, there's nothing else to do tonight but drift. Let the warmth of the fire fade. Let the silence settle. Let the hunger go quiet. You're safe now. Sleep well. I'll be here when the lights go low again.